at all familiar with the life of Charles Haddon Spurgeon, you've probably heard of the Downgrade controversy. Spurgeon spent the final 4 years of his life at war against the trends of early modernism, which, as we've seen, he rightly saw as a threat to biblical Christianity. And boy, did time ever prove him to be absolutely correct. Modernism was everything Spurgeon was concerned it would be and more. The name by which history remembers the controversy Spurgeon found himself in the middle of, the Downgrade controversy, came from the title of a series of articles Spurgeon published in his monthly magazine, The Sword and Trowel. In those articles, Spurgeon wanted to warn his flock about the dangers of moving away from the historic positions of biblical Christianity. In one of these articles, he wrote,
"Biblical truth is like the pinnacle of a steep, slippery mountain. One step away and you find yourself on the downgrade. Once a church or individual Christian gets on the downgrade, momentum takes over and the downslide gets worse."
But here was the scariest part of Spurgeon's warning. Spurgeon warned over and over again that once a church starts compromising and letting worldly philosophies in, recovery is unusual. And recovery occurs only when Christians get on what Spurgeon called the up line, or getting back in the right direction through spiritual revival. And I'm talking about real heaven-sent revival, not revivals that are worked up with emotional music and hyper-emotional preaching. In other words, only God's direct, sovereign intervention will ever pull a church caught in the downgrade out of the tailspin of worldliness once it's become rooted in that church, because they become more and more blind to it. Well, at any rate, as the years went on, the controversy that Spurgeon found himself in increased, and eventually things got so intense that Spurgeon was forced to resign from the Baptist Union. Later, he was even the subject of an official censure by the Union. And within a few years, the Baptist Union was hopelessly lost to the new theology. Spurgeon was dead, and modernism had done its irreparable damage. In 1900, Spurgeon's wife, Susanna, wrote,
"So far as the Baptist Union was concerned, little was accomplished by Mr. Spurgeon's witness-bearing and withdrawal, but in other respects I have had abundant proofs that the protest was not in vain. Many who were far gone on the downgrade were stopped in their perilous descent, and, by God's grace, were brought back to the upline. Others who were unconsciously slipping were made to stand firmly on the rock, while, at least for a time, in all the churches, evangelical doctrines were preached with a clearness and emphasis which had long been lacking."
She believed the Lord would ultimately make clear how right her husband had been in his protest against false doctrine and worldliness. And time did prove his case. Unfortunately, it was too late for too many by then. But the point is, it's not too late for us. In the early part of the 20th century, the false doctrine and worldliness that was spreading, namely the modernism that Spurgeon warned against, and the liberal theology and worldliness that had sucked into the church with it, totally ravaged denominational Christianity throughout the world. Most of the mainline denominations were violently, if not fatally, changed by those influences. The result in Spurgeon's own England was particularly devastating. Think about it. It's been only about 100 years since Spurgeon sounded the alarm against modernism, and most theological education in England is rank liberalism. Church attendance is a fraction of what it was then. You can walk through city after city in England, and big, beautiful churches stand as empty as ghost towns. Evangelicals in England are a tiny minority, and true biblical preaching is extremely uncommon, even in supposedly Bible-believing churches. Even the evangelical movement in England has been severely damaged. It's become dangerously susceptible to almost every theological fad that sweeps across America. If there's some crazy fad in the United States, it's almost instantly imported overseas. In short, evangelicalism in England never recovered from the modernist liberal assault that began a century ago, just as Spurgeon predicted. And the whole point is that those who embraced modernism then, just like pragmatism today, said it would never happen. Can we please learn together from the mistakes that have already been made by the church? I know that to change back from contemporary pragmatic methods to straight, plain teaching will be costly to some ministries, at least in some ways. It may even be likely that some churches will stand to lose those people who do attend their ministries simply because of the worldly appeals. But if our goal is to be obedient to Christ and to preach the Word and then leave the size of the crowds or the number of converts to Him, then have we really lost anything when people leave because they're no longer being superficially impacted? 100 years after modernism, we are seeing history repeat itself. The evangelical church has become worldly in ways that are simply unpredictable in all of church history. Winds of doctrinal compromise are beginning to stir all over again. And that is a far more expensive cost to the church than losing the big crowds. And by the way, that's something else that history should teach us about all of this. Namely, false doctrine and worldliness, the same two influences Spurgeon attacked, always go hand in hand, with worldliness leading the way. So the real question confronting you from this program is this: does a little carnality and worldliness in your church matter? You bet it does. Where worldliness has crept into a church, bad doctrine is soon to follow. And from there, the church begins to spiral down the downgrade at hyperspeed. Christians today tend to forget that modernism was not, first of all, a theological agenda, but a methodological one. In other words, early modernists were not trying to hit at the core of biblical faith. They were simply trying to make Christianity more palatable to a cynical world. That same old insidious carnal reasoning snuck into their thinking. The same thing that's attracting many today. And they began to figure that if they could make Christianity more attractive and package it a little differently and change how the message was delivered, that they would somehow bring more people into the kingdom. When all along, it merely tends to create a lot more false converts and carnal professing Christians than true born-again and holy Christians. And of course, that's exactly what we see in the church today. And don't get me wrong, I'm convinced that most of the people that are behind this current trend toward user-friendly pragmatism would not deliberately undermine biblical Christianity. Nevertheless, they, like the modernists before them, have introduced into the church a carnality and worldliness and a lack of respect for doctrine that, if left unchecked, will eventually reap the same bitter harvest as the modernism of 100 years ago did.
I don't know if you've noticed or not, but I'm not all here. There's 30 pounds of me that's gone from when I was here with you before, and it's been a struggle. And so I drive by Haagen-Dazs ice cream shop, and I try to put the blinders on, and then I look and I wonder, what would God want? So we play these games. Oh, Lord, if you want me to go into Haagen-Dazs, you know, and you're thinking, open up a parking space right in front. Oh, God is wonderful. 6 times around the block, there it was.
And make no mistake about it, the new philosophy is altering the message the church conveys to the world, although many who propound these ideas think of themselves as loyal to biblical doctrine. But whether they think they're being biblical or not, the reality is Christianity is on the downgrade again, and I implore you to just look at the state of the church. I don't mean its size, I mean its holiness, its power. Surely it's an indication of a need to restore true biblical Christianity. So I also implore you to examine your own ministry, especially if you're a pastor. And examine your own pastor if you're a congregation member. Because I'll remind you that the modernism that Spurgeon warned against came right from inside mainstream Christianity. right from some of the most respected pulpits in the country. And that is exactly the same way pragmatism is spreading today. And I'll remind you, the results in the churches of England were devastating. So don't kid yourself. The very long-term life of your own church depends on how it deals with this issue. May God have mercy on His church.